All right, thank you all for coming today. Go ahead and do it. Thank you all for coming today. We have a great talk to you today on FIRPTA, which is foreign real estate and Chinese taxes. And we're gonna get started.
Yes, welcome to Jim and
Yes, Jim. Oh, yeah.
from Fidelity. We're so happy to have you. Apologies for not giving you the correct address to come to, but here.
Well, thank you for having us. We're going to talk about FIRPTA and a few other non-title issues that we deal with. Well, I guess the first thing we should emphasize is that these are non-title issues. So these are issues that if they were to result in a loss, they're not covered by the policy. So the title insurance policy. So we have to be very careful with how we proceed when we're faced with these.
Yeah, I mean, all our liability comes from the policy. And if there is a lien for FIRPTA, that lien will be after the policy is issued. We'll call it a post-policy lien. Therefore, it's really not covered by our policy. What you're doing is an accommodation service, if anything, for your clients, trying to help them what to do. But, you know, just in general, I always say, go see an attorney. There, you know, something like that. If you're the buyer, especially, go see an attorney if you're doing it, because it's an issue that can't come up. It's an issue that's very, very technical, as you'll see by all the different terms that come up on this bulletin and everything. But it's something that can come up, that could be a lien against the property potentially, and something you really do have to worry about. But your job to pass that risk to the buyer, saying, here's the problem. It's a notice issue. You give them the notice saying there may be a FIRPTA issue, but how do you want to deal with it? It's your decision. It's not our decision. We will help you. We will give you the materials we have. We'll give you some advice, but you should really see an attorney and should document all that stuff. What I call is passing the risk ball. We want to pass the risk to you. You pass it to your client. And really, that's what you need to do. And anything you do as an accommodation should be at their direction.
Yeah, FIRPTA is a federal tax issue. We really only know enough to be dangerous. So we've got to be very careful. We don't want to give them legal advice. It is ultimately up to the buyer. There are vendors, I believe, who will handle this for buyers and sellers. But it's something that we've got to be careful with. Okay. So first of all, what is FIRPTA exactly? What are we talking about here? It's the Foreign Investment in Real Property Tax Act. And you know FIRPTA comes up when you have foreign persons who own real estate in the United States and they go to sell. And the IRS expects to get capital gains tax from that sale. And they put the onus on collecting for that tax on the buyer in the transaction. Even though it's seller taxes, they make the buyer responsible because you may have someone selling the property who is not filing taxes in the United States. They may be leaving the United States. The IRS may have a difficult time collecting taxes from that person. So they put the responsibility on the buyer. The buyer is required to withhold typically 15% of the sale price. And if they do not and taxes due, then ultimately it can result in a federal tax lien against the buyer.
Right, and it's weird that it's against the buyer, that they're buying property at somebody else's taxes, but the IRS is not going to chase somebody to Egypt to sue them for taxes. They've got an asset here that they can attach. So they look at that piece of property and say, I want my money from there. If I don't get it from the seller, I'm going to get it from the buyer because I still have a lien against that property. And they really have no other way to get their money, their taxes. This all came around when, I don't know if it was the Japanese or somebody, or the people from the Middle East were buying in New York all the time, and they weren't getting their taxes, and they couldn't go there and collect them. So they came up with this act to make sure it does get collected.
It's confusing for buyers because it doesn't seem fair to them that the IRS would hold them responsible for someone else's taxes. So it can get difficult when you have to deal with it. But that's the enforcement mechanism that they have.
when I first started as an attorney, they taught me every transaction, even if it's I'm selling to Doug, should have a FIRPTA affidavit.
Yeah.
Not in a title sense, but in a legal sense. Because I don't know if he might be from Saudi Arabia, and you know, I just can't tell. And so every transaction should have one. It's not a title document. It's not something you should provide, but the attorneys, if there's an attorney involved, there should always be a FIRPTA affidavit in every single real estate transaction, even if you're selling to your neighbor, just to document.
Sure.
Audits, like then this was part of this, so like, is that something that you would find out if you
We may.
You just find it out when you ask them for numbers for 1099. That's when it comes up normally, doesn't it? The settlement process.
Yes, they'll say we don't have a social security,
Yeah.
and then we ask why, and then we say, how do you get a citizen? And then we're like, oh, you're not FIRPTA, but.
Yeah, okay, I was too off.
Yeah.
Okay.
That's
Otherwise, we don't know.
Yeah.
Again, anybody in this room would not be a citizen, we know.
But if they have a social. Yeah. But if it's social security.
Well, but yeah, there's ways to determine if somebody qualifies for it.
Well, that's our next topic. How do we know when this applies? It applies to foreign persons as defined in the federal statute. The definition is any person other than a United States person. So what is a United States person? A US citizen, a resident alien with a green card. So a green card holder is considered a US person, even though they may not be a citizen. A resident alien who meets the substantial presence test. That's something that we don't typically get into. It's a very fact-specific test going into, you know, how many days of the past year has the person been in the United States? How many days of, year two have they been in the United States? It's not something that we typically want to get into because it would require us to know a lot of facts that we don't really have any way of knowing. Certain entities are not subject to FIRPTA, U.S. corporations, partnerships, other legal entities, because those are U.S. businesses, essentially. If you have an LLC that's been formed in Pennsylvania, that's a United States entity that's paying taxes in the United States. It doesn't matter that the members of that entity may be foreign persons. A few others, certain disregarded entities, foreign entities electing to be treated as domestic corporations. We don't, these don't come up too often. It's not something that we typically have to get into.
Doing residential stuff, it's going to be mostly look for a green card, social security number. You start there, and then you can start looking around to make sure everything's fine. If that's a social number, you ask if they're really paying taxes. If you see that they're paying taxes, you know, that's a good sign there. You've got something to do with. That's something to do with it substantially. If you're in question, always err on the side of their escrowing and going that way.
Yeah, the big out that I usually see is if they have a green card. A lot of times FIRPTA will come up because you'll say, well, the seller's not a U.S. citizen. If they have a green card, they're considered a U.S. person for FIRPTA purposes. So no withholding is necessary.
And usually your market is pretty high end. Those people know that they have an issue. Those sellers know that they either have a green card or they're on a visa. They know what they're doing. They have attorneys involved in it, a high end transaction. So it's not the worst situation.
So the withholding amount, the standard is 15% of the amount realized. That's not the proceeds, that's the sale price in the transaction. So even if you have a sale of a property that's underwater, there are no proceeds, you've still got to withhold 15% of the sale price if the seller is subject to FIRPTA. There is a reduced rate of withholding for transactions between $300,000 and $1 million if the buyer is going to reside in that property as their residence. And that's a 10% withholding. Finally, for transactions that are 300,000 or less, where the buyer is going to reside in the property, there's no withholding. So less than 300K, it's going to be the buyer's residence. there's no withholding, even if the seller would otherwise be subject to FIRPTA.
But even if you get that exemption, get an affidavit from.
Yes.
That's the thing, you need to document saying, I'm authorize you not to hold based on this exemption, because that's not your decision, that's their decision. So always get it in writing from the buyer. It's always the buyer's choice to do that. If the buyer wants to hold the money, they're $300,000, let the buyer and seller work it out. That's not your job. But if they want to rely on that exception saying, okay, I authorize you to go through this transaction. I know there's a possible FIRPTA issue, but because of the exemption, I'm authorizing you not to withhold any money from it.
Yeah, that exemption depends on what the buyer is planning on doing with the property. So it's, to some extent, it's on them. They should definitely sign something because we have no control over how they're going to use the property.
There are sales price where anything under that is just not a non-issue.
No. Yeah, it's always tied to personal residence.
But I think this was an LLC.
It's probably an LLC. Maybe LLC.
Sounds like now, like wedding, like.
Yeah. Yeah.
Like I'm freaking out. Okay, it was an LLC.
Yeah, it was probably a Pennsylvania, United States LLC, so it doesn't matter.
With or without films.
I mean, that's, and sometimes the people with the exemption say it's a non-issue just because it's a $100,000 house that the buyer is going to move into, that they just say, you know, oh, I know this is exemption for it, and people just go through it that way. And not,
And hope that everything.
and hope that everything is fine.
The seller will pay the taxes and they don't get the.
Yeah, even if they don't pay the taxes, there's still an exemption for it, as long as the buyer is using it for a residence.
They are.
Yes.
So, sorry, so that there's no, sorry, okay. House 215.
Mhm.
Okay, so. And then so they're living in
And
it.
buyers,
So if they live in it and it's under 300,000. They're off the hook entirely.
they have an exemption, they're off the hook. We don't tell them they're off the hook, but yes, between you and I, they're off the hook.
So
Would-
even if the seller doesn't pay the taxes, they're not gonna come after right? There's no taxes.
There's no taxes to pay. There's an exemption for that, but always still you get your buyer's acknowledgement of that. We don't want them to rely on you and something ever goes wrong to come back to you and say, no, she told me that there was an exemption for this. You want to say, here's the exemption, look at it, make sure you're fine with this and document that you've given them the exemption, told them about it, but it's their decision to rely on it. So they can say, no, I don't want to rely on it. I want us to hold the money. So it's not your decision to do that. It's their decision.
Yeah, we're not their attorneys or their CPAs.
Thousands, they're living in it, no one's technically gonna.
Yes, technically.
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 It should come out.
See, we're attorneys. We get out of this stuff all the time. But yeah, good, I like questions.
Yeah,
Okay, so I just recently went through this as well, but it's under 300,000 and my client was just graduated from law school, so they're consultant for me.
Those are the worst.
And on the federal page, it said the buyer has to live in the property for 2 years, and if they sell it within those first 2 years, that's their subject to the tax.
Yeah.
Okay, yeah, I was like, that's the same. We went over that multiple times, so we're just like crazy.
all the more reason for the buyer to acknowledge that, they're not electing withholding if they choose not to.
So my next question is, can a buyer force sellers to withhold and possibly these decisions?
Yeah,
Buyer
I
can do
think
whatever
they could.
Or the sellers like, no, I'm not. holding.
That's between them. I mean, they've got to work that out.
That's why that risk fall, we push it to them to decide what to do. Let them, put them in a room and let them duke it out.
Yeah, I mean, we don't need to close until buyer and seller have reached an agreement.
If they want to get indemnities, if they want to get some insurance, otherwise between the buyer and the seller, some guarantee that if it does come up, you'll pay for it, and here's your forwarding address, they could do that. But it's not our decision, it's the buyer's decision. It's
Oh, yeah. I hear that as a buyer's decision, but it would like, what if like buyers have locked on a hold, but it also these extensions, and the seller's like, well, no, I'm not holding. Like, what do I do as an agent?
Probably that could be decided not to move forward.
Yeah.
And it doesn't fall necessarily under like home inspection or, you know, mortgage contingency doesn't fall under anything, so it was just kind of curious.
Yeah, I mean, it would be in front of a judge at that point.
Yeah,
I mean,
that's,
somebody saying somebody else breached the contract. I don't know how a court would look at that specifically.
Coming up.
Well, I guess in it's a listing, they could try to find out.
Yeah, there is a whole paragraph in it.
I tend to think that,
Is you guys helping out with getting it knowing that there's going to be this situation, you know?
It's easier when we're the listing than.
Yeah.
Everybody has
Yeah.
You know, somebody were to do that, then, but otherwise, how do we find out it's political? And again, we're still doing T packet,
Yeah.
and they say they're on social, and they could file by warrants.
Yeah.
So we're definitely further down the line,
Yeah.
you know?
and like you said, I mean, the buyer has to live in the property for a certain number of years in order for that exemption to apply. So if they say, oh, I'm only going to be there for a year, I know I'm going to be subject to the tax ultimately, then they, you know, that's a good bargaining chip against the seller, but it's still between the buyer and the seller. Okay. Any other questions before we move on?
have you held any escrows for FIRPTA? Sure.
I've never personally held an escrow, I just asked to collect the money
Right.
and, deal with it, bring the table then. I don't want to be responsible for holding an escrow for years while somebody figures it out.
But what did you send it to the?
We should actually hold the escrow, though. I think what we said, if they had to get an attorney involved, you hold the escrow.
There you, that's, see, that's. the
Yeah,
best thing.
that's
You just
good.
get out of it.
I couldn't hear you from.
Yeah, basically,
Oh, yeah.
yeah, you want an attorney or some independent third party to hold the escrow,
Not the title,
not,
Yeah,
not the.
because again, it's not a title issue.
yeah.
We get put in the middle because we're the, you know, Joe party, yeah.
I'm so sorry, on this, but then if you have an attorney hold escrow, who pays for the attorney and how long do they hold the escrow? Like, how long would this get dragged out for, and then who can delegate it to what, and how do you decide? What if someone's like, well, I'm not paying for it, and then now they're back for it?
Well, I mean, once the attorney's holding the escrow, it's really out of our hands. It's up to the buyer and the seller to
Yeah,
figure
it's
out
all
who
part of the escrow.
pays.
You know,
Well, how do you draft that escrow? Who pays the escrow?
you don't draft it, the parties draft it, the attorney drafts it, the attorney drafts it. You know, whichever way, whoever's hiring, it's gonna hold it for X amount of days, just like we would do most likely, and send it to the IRS after so many days. You know, or get some confirmation from the IRS that they're not subject to it. Either one or the other, he will send it, he or she will send it to the IRS at that point.
So,
But you can't go wrong sending it to the IRS because the IRS isn't gonna steal your money. They're probably better than the attorney.
So hang on to it.
They'll hang on to it.
Yeah.
But if you don't,
Yeah.
use the IRS, they will always give your money back if you fill out 100 forms. So it's not the worst thing to do if you send excess money to the IRS, because they are gonna send it back. to
Yeah.
us.
Yeah.
They're not there to make profit. So it's not the worst thing to do to send it there.
So, am I understanding it correctly that it's not, let's say, for one of these exemptions, you know, that it's only 10% instead of 15%, assuming the buyer lives there for 2 years. So it's really not even clear until after 2 years what the actual amount is.
That's true. Yeah, that's true.
Yeah.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, say the buyer bought it and then turned around and sold it a year later. They would have been subject to the 15% if they knew in advance that they were going to do that.
But if the money was sent to the IRS, let's say at closing.
Mhm.
And then the seller petitioned to get money back and then it like be released back to the seller in less than 2 years.
Yeah, I mean, the IRS is going to make a determination of how much in capital gains tax, say, the seller owes. It may not be that full 10%. I mean, we don't know.
If you get that escrow and send it to the IRS, you're golden.
Mhm.
Right? That is the gold standard, because at that point, they're dealing with the IRS. You've done your job, you've held your 10 or 15%.
It's not fake in the back.
Yeah, if they have
Yeah.
a problem, they want to divvy it up a different way, they talk to the IRS at that point. You've done your job and sent that 10 or 15%. And always remember, it's a sales price too. That's the kicker. People think it's the profit, but no, it's the sales price. So if you send that to them, there's nothing that could go wrong at that point.
Mhm. Yeah, it's out of your hands. And you've done what the IRS asks of you. withhold the correct percentage and send it to them. So.
Question? Okay. Yeah. Not an easy issue to deal with because, A, nobody knows that much about it. There's not that many attorneys that deal with it. And, you know, everybody's confused and people in Pennsylvania don't get attorneys involved in their transactions that much. And that's the problem, that's the case, especially when you're a buyer. Why do I have to get an attorney involved when my seller's a foreign person? No, it just seems like a waste to the people, and there's a lot of pushback on it. It's a risk that they're taking on, doing that in that transaction. And if you're representing the buyer, you've got to tell them, like, look, it's an issue and you really have to think about what you want to do. If you want to take the risk with the exemption, if you want to withhold, if you want to talk to an attorney and get their advice, it's really, you know, counseling with your buyer as far as what they want to do. But always get that risk ball and shove it back to them, saying it's your decision what you want to do. Here's all the information. You could give them that IRS publication that's attached to there, which has a lot of good stuff in it. Say this is the whole thing, but it's your decision as to what you want to do to go forward.
Yeah, the risk is that the buyer could get a federal tax lien against them. And that would be sometime after the closing. It wouldn't be covered by their title policy. So they'd be on the hook for it. So yeah, buyer really has to proceed with caution and make sure they're comfortable. Well, I think that's all we have for FIRPTA on the slides. We can take more questions, but we do have a few other non-title issues.
To make sure I get a chance to, so if someone is a US citizen, or has a green card, would they definitely have social security number?
That's a good question.
I think you do.
Yeah, I think
You get
so.
some type of a tax ID number with a green card as well. It might be a 23 number, but it's some type of a tax identification number.
Okay, so if you have a social security number, you're definitely not foreign person, is that fair to say?
I think in most cases you probably are, but
It's the same, they won't use social security. That's the, they won't even use it for anything else.
Okay, so what I'm wondering is if there's a way to, as a buyer's agent, to have the seller, basically, the seller kind of sign an affidavit saying, I'm not a foreign person.
Mhm.
And.
Yeah.
They just, they are, and they just sign it, then, if that was, it's still not really protected, right? So
No, well, you could sue the seller in Egypt when he goes back there. Then you're at the same problem there. You're the same problem with the IRS with the affidavit. But as I said in the beginning, every transaction should have a FIRPTA affidavit in it. What good it does your practicality. If the person's still staying in the United States, it's fine if they're moving around. But, you know, you could certainly have them sign the affidavit and you could tell them that that's the case. You know, if you have any question, that's, you know, at least get the affidavit and some type of an indemnity. You know, raises if anything comes up.
Sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off. For us, I feel like that's not enough. Like, if we're trying to help our client, we fall on the hook all the time. And they're trying to at night, when things go wrong, we will not sleep until we actually know the answer. So we're trying to figure out what are some of the questions we can ask the listing agent. Maybe it's after we're under contract, because nobody wants to ask all these questions that they're not gonna do. Right? So maybe after under contract, we can ask the listing agent directly and maybe have a list of questions that we can come up with together and collaborate to figure out how we can secure a situation for our buyers and make us sleep better at night.
Yeah, I mean, the title insurance and just conveyancing, the more knowledge you have, the better.
Yeah.
The more knowledge, and I'm getting it from buyers, getting it from sellers, it's like pulling teeth. But, you know, you give them a questionnaire, the title company has sort of a questionnaire, don't you, to send out?
Yes,
From there.
sometimes they answer, sometimes they don't.
Yeah.
Sometimes the listing agent gives us their contact information, sometimes they do.
Yeah.
You can add as part of your contract.
That's where a lot. And as a seller, are you a US citizen? When the courts come back to us, the question was answered, no, but it's, give us an opportunity to try to figure it out.
As part of your sales contract.
Like, we asked for that time, then they feel like they have to answer our questions, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
So I
So
think
part of the situation for you guys is then, once you're already in that contract, and then you're talking about 15% of your sale price. Your contract is a whole different contract, right? I mean, if you knew, this is my theory, if you knew that they were not a US citizen and there's 15% tax, right? It basically affects your sale price, right? So, you know,
But I feel like that's on the seller.
it is on the seller.
They're gonna.
So the buyer is responsible for the tax. I will tell you, as a title company, we try to collect funds from the seller
Right.
and submit it out of the seller's receipt.
Yeah.
But again, even if they're underwater, right?
Right.
And it's a $1,000,000 property, solved situation,
Yeah.
that somebody's gonna do it. Who's paying?
I think it's just helpful to know upfront who that could potentially be. When you're during that process of
When you get,
asking the question.
when you get the signed contract, why don't you just have an addendum to the contract too, a FIRPTA notice saying, please let us know, can you please confirm that both the parties signed this contract are United States citizens?
Right, that's like what I'm trying to.
Yeah.
One of the things that we have that, it's a big deal.
Yeah, we don't have to,
Not like it is social, the other things just to, I mean, at the end of the day, people are lying, like.
Yeah.
Right, you kind of can't someone into truth.
if you get that, if you,
Come to the world.
Yeah, if you have an affidavit though,
90% of your problems are solved if you get that affidavit saying, letter saying, I'm a United States citizen. 95% of the people there are fine. You'll have a few stragglers, but if you get that as part of your contract, once signed saying, please sign this as well. We're signing everything else. We're going to sign that. And you don't need their social security number. They're going to giving that, but at least if they sign that, you've got some assurance that there's not going to be a FIRPTA issue that's going to come up later.
You never move. Oh, isn't there a social, bar, social?
Yeah, I'm actually, they were nice concern. I was removing, it's not gonna make sense because I feel like ultimately.
Well, I was just saying, we can in general, yeah, so, I would. Yeah.
Just that time on the same side, it's almost like, I mean, I think it's good, but I still.
You want to.
Yeah, trust us, it's all right, I'm not gonna trust the policy. It's like,
Does the affidavit, can the affidavit signed, will that protect the buyer from any people property when the seller? Okay.
Nope, it's just for informational purposes, at least to give you a heads up. That's all that is to give you a heads up that there's going to be a problem. That's the purpose. Yeah, if they sign honestly. Oh, hopefully people sign honestly, but yeah, that's all it does. It heads up, you can address the problem when you're in the beginning of the contract. You don't have money into the house, you don't have everything done. You can address the problem at that point, tell the people, look, see an attorney, this is going to be an issue. And they might think twice before they go forward with it.
And I have a question about the exclusion, so does that also count for like prior transactions? So I'm representing a buyer, buying a house from Kristen, who's a foreign person, I get it, and this transaction title insurance doesn't cover it. Let's say in this transaction, I don't pay the FIRPTA, whatever, now I sell the house to Sharice, does her title insurance protect her?
hers would, because you would have been subject to withholding as the buyer. So if there was a federal tax lien, it would be against you. It wouldn't necessarily be against the real estate.
Well,
It goes to the individual.
it goes to the individual and everything they own at the time it's filed.
Right.
So you assume you're on.
So it could be a lien if they filed it, but
Someone who bought and sold a house within 2 years, that happens.
Mhm.
But figuring out the person who bought it, not for the person, it sounds like no, because it's not going to stick with.
yeah, the
house.
title search would reveal any federal tax liens. So
And then in 6 months from now, it's not going to go to my new house, it's going to go to that person.
exactly.
Right.
Mhm. Okay. Any other questions about FIRPTA? We'd like to.
Keep that IRS publication around. That's really helpful. That's like the best thing to have, that explains all these terms and what they mean and all that kind of stuff. When people do ask a question, you can talk to that. That's available on IRS website.
Yeah, these are the instructions for completing the IRS form. Very detailed.
Could we? The seller has to sign things for sale, right? Could we have?
and all of those actions of the seller is signed and saying that. Or that they're not part of the. Well, we have that when we fill out their 1099 forms, we get their social, so if we don't get a social, we ask the question.
But you're only asking for a 1099 form.
No, it's just another title issue.
So there's a fine line about discrimination as well, right? So we have to be careful about how we ask.
Right, or it could be in the FIRPTA, right, like in FIRPTA. Salary side of the docs. Because that's again from the perspective of the bureaus and five house.
Yeah. Is there a document we can get, Jim?
There are FERC affidavits all over, but that's a Compass decision, that's a specific. It's not a Fidelity
Yeah.
affidavit. You could do whatever you want internally as far as that goes. You just go online and you find something. You know, it's basically one line saying,
Yeah.
I am a United States citizen and I sent it to you.
We can definitely.
Yeah, you can look into that. You can have a separate one.
So the issue again, then, is not the title, issue,
Right.
right? We're not restoring. So that's one of the reasons why I said the companies try not to get involved in it. Right.
Yeah, because if we make it part of our documents, it looks like it's covered.
Yeah.
So that's why I like to have it as a separate document, just there saying, you know, this is just additional information for the closing, but it's not part of the title insurance.
So we're not assuming this risk. It's still.
We did, I didn't believe it.
Yeah, we're so far. Yeah. Like, that's what I was saying about when I said your negotiations, you know, you would negotiate potentially differently if you knew there was 15%, that the buyer's gonna be expected to pay, right?
Well, that's where it will come with your home inspection, but then we
Yeah.
negotiate that. 15%.
It's probably multiple layers.
Yeah, I like that.
Then it's from the start, it's the title side, it's conversations between agents, so, yeah.
At least when we hear about it, it always seems to come up at the closing. So,
Yeah.
Yeah, it comes up,
Somebody, you can hear somebody in settlement.
Yeah. exactly, or you can ask for the 1099, now for the social for the 1099,
Right, because they don't want to, it's a package at the time.
then you know that there's a problem. But we don't hear anything until then. It's always the ones that scare you too, because if you have a Japanese name, you always ask them just in case, and that's the script. You should be asking everybody.
Everybody, yes, one, yes, all.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, it can just be a separate one-line affidavit. You just-
Okay, yeah.
Yeah.
Well, it's not this kind of concept, this is.
Fiber, get a home inspection on everybody.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Totally scared, sorry.
What's it say? Section level 5 of the Internal Revenue Code provides the buyer, the U.S. real property interest must withhold tax if the seller is a foreign person, to inform the buyer whether withholding of taxes is or is not required on any disposition of a U.S. real property interest. Name, seller hereby certify the following, and then there's 2 check boxes. One is seller is a foreign person, etc. One is seller is not a foreign person, etc. Then it asks for tax ID number, seller talks address, for selling price, and penalty of perjury, a signature.
Yeah, you could even,
Mhm.
you can mix that with.
That's it.
Fidelity has some openings. One works for us. There's a couple other issues that I guess we can talk about that are really not title issues that we decided to bring up since we're here on that issue. Want to do?
Sure. Yeah, I don't know how often you run into this, but bulk sales is an issue that comes up if you have a seller, a business entity that's selling at least 51% of their assets. And it's very similar to FIRPTA in that unless the buyer gets a clearance certificate from the state beforehand, they're going to be subject to any liens that might result if there's a shortfall in that tax payment. So that this is for situations where you have a business that is selling most of their assets, maybe they're winding up, maybe they're moving out of state, and the state of Pennsylvania is concerned that they may not be able to get whatever taxes are still due. So they put the responsibility on the buyer, just like for FIRPTA. The problem with getting the tax clearance certificate, that will clear the buyer from liability, but it takes some time. So they may not be able to get that certificate before they're closing. And so oftentimes they want somebody to hold an escrow for any taxes that may be due. I think it used to be much more common for us to hold these escrows.
Years and years ago, it was common. We had so many of them around. You'll see commitments around from some title agents still have waivers on it, disclaimer saying this does not cover bulk sales. We've just decided not to address it since if we don't cover it, we're not going to say we don't cover it again if it's not part of the title policy. But years ago, the Department of Revenue thought it was a pre-policy, it was covered. And they finally clarified and said, no, the legal post policy against them. So whenever it comes up, we just say, and the good thing is it's businesses. Businesses usually have attorneys. So you can count on the attorney to do it and the attorney to hold the escrow. Most times they're LLCs, corporations, things like that. So you're dealing with a little bit more sophisticated people. But it's when you sell substantially all more than 50% of the assets of a corporation. And it's the same theory as FIRPTA, really, because they don't have that corporation to go after. There's no assets left in that corporation. So they don't have anybody to rate the register at. They want to make sure they get their money from the taxpayer.
There you go. Does that apply to an LLC? Let's say they only own one property, right? So they own 100% of their assets to my client. Does it apply?
Yeah, I think it would. I don't know how often in,
LLC about property like the flips, right? Are
Yeah.
also property
Yeah.
LLCs, so then that-
I thought it did. Maybe not. Let's see.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, I think strictly speaking, they should get a clearance certificate, right? Or I don't know how often. I don't think they do now.
Nobody
No.
does. We have all those SQS and nobody ever does.
Yeah,
I mean,
that's
it's
true.
heard of lots of issues coming up.
Right.
No, I mean, I think it usually comes up with operating entities that aren't just pass-throughs that hold one property. I don't think I've never heard of a case where you have an LLC that just owns a property, sells it, and then buyer gets hit with bulk sales.
And an LLC won't be paying any income tax anyway.
Right.
LLCs are pass-throughs, so there's not that double taxation. That's the whole purpose of an LLC, so they really don't have much taxes being owed. Because now they're not paying any capital stock or anything else after 2017. So really for an LLC, purpose LLC, I don't think it would matter.
Oh, that's true. Yeah.
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 Pass through it.
Whether they had 100 properties and they were selling 60, now city.
Yeah.
Is there an affidavit?
The tax, how long does it take when they say?
6 months.
Yeah.
At least. Yeah, it's a long time because they have to really go through it. It's a winding up of the corporation almost.
Yeah. The state has to figure out what taxes they owe.
Those corporations, what are the business entities, I guess, that we looking into, the corporation? Or
Definitely corporations. I mean, partnerships, I suppose it would. Limited partnerships, at least.
Partnerships don't pay tax.
Corporate taxes, yeah, I suppose that's
Yeah.
true.
They don't pay tax, so it would just be corporations.
Yeah.
Just corporations. Yeah, just corporations, really, even if it's an entity, it's an operating entity. If it's, Jim's dog business or whatever, and you're selling it, basically closing down the business. That's what you're looking for. If you're really selling, but sometimes you're selling the stock and the assets, that's what you look for. When you're really, that's the trigger. You see the whole business being sold. That's when you really look for bulk sales.
And the enforcement mechanism is the same as it is for FIRPTA, except it's the state. Ultimately, the buyer could get a state tax lien against them after the closing. Unless they get the clearance certificate.
Like, so if I be like INC, like.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Would be the only one I should like write the
Yeah.
charge on. And it's only if they're selling 51% of their assets, like within is there a certain period of time?
In that transaction that you're insured.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, you don't have to go to ask them everything else they sold. If that transaction you're working on, right, John?
Yeah, that's true. That's true. But assets includes everything that they own. So it
Yeah.
can
so
be
that's-
difficult for us to determine whether
Yeah.
our transaction really is 51% of their assets, because we don't know what else that business owns.
Yeah, I've seen it very rarely. It's always, the only time I ever see it come up is when you're selling a business. There's real estate associated with the business. Then it comes up because you really are selling the bulk assets of that corporation.
Okay, so they own, if a corporation has 10 properties, there's some, 6 of them, they're on the market, and I buyers. During the working.
Well, I think we're thinking of operating businesses like, an industrial facility where they're making widgets.
Yeah.
Right. Mhm.
Yeah.
No. Okay, so this just goes through use of affidavits, and the application for the clearance certificate. And usually if this is an issue, buyer and seller are going to have attorneys who will take care of this. Not a title issue. Why I think we talked about that. It would be a post policy event. If there is a state tax lien that's filed against the buyer, it's going to be after our data policy, and it wouldn't be covered. Should you handle it? We really advise against getting involved in this and FIRPTA to the extent that you can avoid it. So I would ask the attorneys to hold the escrow.
Yeah.
I think that would be the.
Anytime you can get out of holding an escrow, get out of holding an
Yeah.
escrow, whatever it's for. That's, unless it's a title issue, it's a really strict title issue.
Mhm.
Otherwise, you don't want to hold it because what are escrows? Problems. Problems for people to fight over.
Yeah.
Left and right, because they just get involved in it, they get too personal about it, they don't want, they have to get people's signatures to release it. It's just a pain to keep them around.
If there's a dispute, it just turns into a real headache. If one party wants the money released and the other doesn't, then
I've had agents have to go to court where the parties are fighting, and I had an agent that did that. She was so funny, she just went in, Your Honor, here's a check, you deal with it. Yeah, the court took it. She said, I went to check out to the court took it, said, oh, we'll hold this money now. All right.
well, you want to have a term like that in your escrow agreement that you can pay the funds into court in the event of a dispute.
Yeah, that's what
And then
she
you
did.
can wash your hands of it.
Walk right in here, okay, I'm done, goodbye. That's really what you need to do.
Well, that's why it's important to have escrow agreements.
That gets to our next topic.
Yeah, so holding escrows for title versus non-title issues. We've talked about some non-title issues, bulk sales, FIRPTA, where you want to try not to hold an escrow. But we deal with old mortgages, judgments, municipals, inheritance tax. It's probably the big one that we hold escrows for. But inheritance tax is a title issue. If somebody owns a property and they've died, there's a lien on that property for inheritance tax, even though nothing's filed. So you've got to either make sure that tax has been paid or you've got to escrow for it. IRS liens, question mark. We don't really want to hold escrows for IRS liens. We'd rather that they get taken care of before the closing. We do agree from time to time to do that, but we We like to put a big cushion in.
Yes, we like to make escrows very painful.
Yeah.
Very painful, at least the general escrow rule is 1.5. And if it really mean, we sometimes go up to 2. Because people should have these things, if there's an IRS lien there, you know of it, you should be able to get a payoff beforehand. There's no reason. The typical one is people find in the city of Philadelphia, they're so angry at closing, they want you to hold the money for the nuisance liens. 3 months later, nobody's done anything, we just have to pay it anyway. That's the problem with the escrows. That really, we try to make them, and these are just for title things, these are just for liens against the property. We're not gonna hold for things that aren't liens against the property. You know, your agency can do whatever you want within your company as far as those other escrows, but these are title specific escrows. For liens against the property, taxes, you know, things like that, that you're legitimately disputing. So I've been putting in the escrow agreements now saying, he's gonna appeal his taxes. If you don't do it in 30 days, we're gonna pay the escrow, tough luck.
Yeah, keep the time period limited, for sure.
And just do it. If they don't like it, it just happened to the house I bought. He's screaming about his taxes. 30 days later, he didn't do anything about it. He just paid it. He said, oh, well, my fault. But we really tried to put a short leash on it to get it done. And if you're representing sellers, you should know that if you've got the title report there, you should know, you know, what's there and what you have to deal with. It's not that hard to get some stuff done, but always remember the general rule is the minimum we're ever going to escrow is 150% of whatever's outstanding that we can see in the public records. And, you know, sometimes we go up from there, and it's really old, we might go up to 200%.
Exactly. Yeah. If you're gonna hold an escrow, it's a good idea to hold more than enough. One, because of interest and penalties, and two, if you don't hold enough, there's less incentive for the seller to take care of it. If you hold $1,000 for something, the seller may say it's more than $1,000 headache if I was actually going to clear this. So we'll definitely hold enough. So some non-title issues that sometimes we get asked to hold escrows for: repairs, inspections, you know, credit cards, bulk sales. We talked about that. We try not to hold escrows for non-title issues.
If there's a dispute for the water line, something, the well at the back, that they have to fix, things like that, the home inspection. That's not a title issue. That's a buyer and seller issue. They have to decide how they're going to work that themselves and find a place to do that escrow. That's not a title issue. That's a buyer seller issue. They have to work that out between them. And then that's their issue as far as that goes. Like we hold for title issues.
Exactly.
Another good time to bring in an attorney.
Mhm.
He or she could hold the escrow.
Exactly.
That's,
Yes.
yep, that's the best thing to have somebody to do that. This escrows, they're so old that people just leave them there. I've seen escrows $40,000, 10 years old. People don't pick up their money.
Mhm.
They don't realize it. I'm like, I have $500 and I want it back now. Escrows that you're a student in the state.
Mhm.
The money just stays in the state for 2 years.
Yeah, I mean, that's the problem too. And I'm sure you're always worried about escrowing for old mortgages and stuff like that. That's something that we decide on a case by case basis.
Yeah.
Some of those old mortgages we'll take out. The 70s and the 80s, we're now taking them out. Even some in the 90s, but that's a case by case basis, and it also escrow and content required to get it done that way. But that is a title issue that we can escrow for, but again, we try to get it resolved beforehand if possible.
And as soon as we're on it, like, even the mortgages, the case by case, sometimes it's a line of credit will weigh out differently than fixed rate mortgage.
Mhm.
Because they still have to be building withdrawal, which is just a lot of risk, right? So again, everything is way.
And a mortgage that your own sellers is different than a prior owner mortgage.
Yeah.
A prior owner mortgage is a lot easier to take out. The sellers, it's your own responsibility. You should be getting a sense for that. If it's somebody who you bought it from and they just forgot to do it, you see title insurance there, we're pretty liberal on that. But when it's your own mortgage, you should be responsible for your own housekeeping of them. That's one of the things that the first thing we look at See if it's the seller's mortgage or prior, and the seller being, you know, his kids, it still goes up there. It's not, that's still seller mortgage. It's not, that's a new owner, just because you got your kid out when you're done. That's still yours.
Yeah, if your seller has owned the property for 20 years and there's a mortgage from the prior owner, that's easier to get rid of.
Question, problems you're having, anything with your transactions? Something to say yes to and make friends?
I mean, not your issue really, but just kind of curious when it comes to multifamily. So is there anything that you guys have learned or you're in regards to the legalities of the actual zoning status? Just, I knew the answer was no, but.
Yeah.
Yeah, so
Deed on record, that's really all that we require is get the deed on record, what we use the property for. So we said you own that property, what you do with it, is your concern, as far as getting that done. And Philadelphia. Good luck getting.
Bring that.
Thank you.
sure.
Feel free if you have any questions after this or questions on transactions, just pass them on to title people. We'd be happy to talk to you about it, even individually or through your representatives here. We want to get transactions done because nobody wants to make life unbearable. We have to do what we have to do, but we all don't get paid if transactions don't close. So we're not here to put roadblocks in there. We're here to help you get these done best way we know how to do it.
For sure.
All right.
Thank you.
Yes.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Sure.
Yeah. Well, we did record this entire, when you talk to people like here, or if you like the slides, please let me know. Yeah, and then if you get any follow-up information, also let us know.
Yeah, and then put our document, send that out.
That was very informative. Yeah,